We do.
Mhm.
All right, if, so we've got enough people here now to have a quorum, so.
Yeah.
All right, so if everybody will calm down, we're gonna start the meeting now. So this is a special meeting of the Finfish Committee, and the reason we're having this special meeting is because certain things happened at last meeting, and I told them to adjourn the meeting and leave. And I'd like to, first off, apologize to everybody, but I wasn't here. And the situation seemed like something that we didn't need to carry on with, so I decided it's my fault for having to drive from wherever twice. You can blame me, and I'm very sorry to the committee members, to the people in the public that are here, and to the division staff for having to do this again. But from my position, it seemed like the right thing to do. And so with that, we'll move forward. They opened the meeting, they approved the agenda before, but I think we need to approve it. So if I can have a motion to approve the agenda and a second.
Second.
And so all in favor, I don't think we need to just show of hands. Okay, and that's unanimous. And so the minutes were approved, and we don't have to do that again. And so I guess we will move on with the presentation on spotted sea trout. And what we're gonna do is, right after their presentation, before we discuss it and all, I'm gonna let them make public comment. I found that it's better to let them also hear what's going on from you guys, then do their public comment, and then let us make our discussion. That way, if they have anything in public comment that we feel like we would like to know about, then we can know about those things. And it just seems like it's better than doing it at the beginning before the presentation made, or doing it at the end after we've already made our decision. It just, to me, it seems like it's better for the public. So that's the way I'd like to do it. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
All right. Well, good evening again, committee members. We appreciate the chance to be here tonight and talk about Amendment 1 Spotted Sea Trout FMP. I'm Lucas Pensinger, a biologist right here in the Morehead City office. Up here with me is Melinda Lambert, who's a biologist out of the Minio office. We are the co-leads for this Spotted Sea Trout FMP. Our presentation today is going to focus on reviewing the draft of Amendment 1 of the Spotted Sea Trout FMP. And after the presentation, we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And then ultimately, the action item tonight is for the advisory committee to vote on management recommendations to deliver to the Marine Fisheries Commission. So Melinda and I will present those recommendations, any of those that you vote on tonight, to the commission after November business meeting. So before we get to that, I would like to just again briefly review where we are in the fishery management plan process here. So here we're just looking at that timeline, which starts with initial public comments. So when a division stock assessment says that there's maybe some adjustments to the plan that needs to happen, we start with that for the public scoping. And then our current step is noted right there with that yellow chevron and a nice UR here and a black arrow. With the commission AC's meeting to review the draft and receive comments. And then that next step, as I mentioned previously, is for the Marine Fisheries Commission to select their preferred management option. And a part of that process will be a presentation from Melinda and I, just reviewing the public comment that we've heard during this period, as well as any management recommendations that advisory committees have voted. So I'll start our presentation here today, or at least the meat of our presentation, because we've already technically started it, by reviewing the structure of Amendment 1 and then what's contained and discussed within each of the major sections. So we'll start that with the base plan, and then an overview of the information and issue papers, the division's preliminary management recommendations, and then we'll finish up by touching base on that timeline of Amendment 1. So the base plan provides a lot of the background information for Amendment 1. It includes things like the goal and objectives of the plan, spotted sea trout life history, the management unit, characterization of the recreational and commercial fisheries, and a summary of the 2020 spotted sea trout stock assessment and stock status. So we will briefly touch on each of those things today, but all those topics are covered in a whole lot more detail in the base plan. Commission approved the goal and objectives of Amendment 1 at their May 2023 business meeting. So the goal of this plan is to manage the spotted sea trout fishery to maintain a self-sustaining population that provides sustainable harvest based on science-based decision-making processes. When we talk about the management unit for this fishery management plan, we're talking about all the spotted sea trout within the coastal and joint fishing waters of North Carolina. Spotted sea trout are distributed pretty much coast-wide in North Carolina, and they're found everywhere from the rivers and the sounds and the marshes to the ocean. While they generally reside in estuarine waters for their entire life cycle, they do have some seasonal migration patterns. So in winter, they move south and aggregate deep in the creeks and bays estuary, and then in the spring and summer, they move back north and spread out into the rivers and sounds. So the spotted sea trout fishery in North Carolina is predominantly a recreational fishery. So here we're looking at recreational and commercial landings from biological years 1991 to 2023. Biological years just from March through February the following year. And then the height of each bar is total landings in that year. The yellow portion of the bar is commercial landings, and the purple portion of the bar is recreational landings. Since current management was fully put into place in 2012, recreational harvest has accounted for about, I almost got myself backwards there. Recreational harvest has accounted for about 86% of total harvest, and commercial harvest has accounted for about 14%. Landings in both sectors are pretty variable year to year, but recreational landings have generally increased throughout the time series with some periods of very low harvest in both sectors following cold studies. So here, these red arrows are just showing those years that the director closed the spotted sea trout fishery due to a cold stun. Landings in both sectors increased pretty dramatically in 2019 and have remained high through 2022. In 2023, however, we do see recreational landings decline pretty sharply. Commercial landings also decreased in 2023, although that drop wasn't quite as steep as what we saw recreationally. It's hard to say exactly why landings were down last year, because it's unlikely that that drop was due to any one specific reason. But I will say, based on preliminary landings year to date in 2024, it looks like 2024 is going to be more in line with 2019, 20, 21, and 22. And really, I only mention that because assuming the trend so far this year continues, 5 of the past 6 years of spotted sea trout harvest will represent the 5 highest years of harvest in the entire time series. So in other words, spotted sea trout in North Carolina have never experienced this level of harvest for this sustained period of time, going the whole way back to at least 1991, if not before. So for this graph, we're pulling out just recreational landings. And we're showing the average percentage of recreational landings by month since 2012, which again represents that current period of spotted sea trout harvest or spotted sea trout management. Recreational harvest occurs pretty much year round, although most harvest occurs in the late fall. And there might be some minor regional differences in these patterns, but they're pretty broadly consistent across the state. About 70% of recreational harvest occurs in the peak October to February season. And then there is a small increase in landings that we see in June and July there, which is likely due to tourism and vacationing anglers. So for this graph, we're looking at, it's basically the same graph, except now we're pulling out commercial landings by month. And we see a similar pattern in the commercial fishery. So here we're showing percent of commercial landings by month, and it's for that same time period since 2012. Similar to the recreational fishery, we see a large peak in landings, and then that peak it does extend a little bit more into the winter. So approximately 71% of commercial harvest occurs in these peak months. Harvest of spotted sea trout remains a bit higher in the colder months as those fish aggregate into smaller water bodies where they overwinter, but can also be landed in larger numbers due to those aggregations. And then harvest tends to decline again as water is warm and fish disperse. So this graph is showing the portion of commercial landings by gear type each biological year, where the color of each bar corresponds to the gear type. So historically, the spotted sea trout fishery was in North Carolina was predominantly anchored gill nets, which are the light blue portion, each of those bars at the bottom. In more recent years, however, runaround gill nets, which are the gray portion of the bars towards the top, have become the most common gear. And you can kind of see that trend as you move from left to right on the graph, as those blue portions of the bar representing anchored gill nets get smaller, and the gray portions representing those runaround gill nets get larger. The single asterisks on 2016, 18, and 20 are just showing years that beach seine landings are combined with other gears. And then the double asterisks on 2022 is when beach seine and hull seine landings were combined with other gears. And that's just because of data confidentiality in these years. There's limited participants in those fisheries anymore. So some of y'all are probably sick of hearing me talk about this, but I did want to briefly remind everyone of the stock status of spotted sea trout, and starting with whether or not the stock is overfished. The good news is, in the final year of the stock assessment, spawning stock biomass, or SSB, was well above the threshold SSB, which means the spotted sea trout stock is not overfished. In other words, in that final year, there's plenty of mature female fish to sustain the population. However, this graph is showing the overfishing status of spotted sea trout. The individual points are the ratio of estimated fishing mortality, or F, to the 20% F threshold. F is just the rate at which fishing activities are removing fish from the population. That solid black line at 1 is the maximum ratio where fishing mortality is sustainable. So that would be where F, as estimated by the model, is equal to that 20% threshold. So in other words, we want to see points that are below that black line. We want to see F that is below the threshold F rates. But if we look at that final year of the stock assessment, the ratio is above the black line, which means that overfishing is occurring. So long story short, there's plenty of biomass to sustain the spotted sea trout fishery, but we're fishing them at an unsustainable rate. To keep spotted sea trout biomass at levels that support the great fishery we've had in recent years, we need to end overfishing by reducing fishing mortality. For the rest of today's presentation, we'll focus on the appendices of Amendment 1, which include discussions of management options to end overfishing, as well as discussions of supporting information and other options that might benefit the stock. And I'll start with Appendix 1, which is an information paper characterizing small mesh gill nets in the spotted sea trout fishery. At their August 2021 business meeting, the Marine Fisheries Commission passed a motion to not institute rulemaking on small mesh gill nets, but to instead refer that issue through the fishery management plan process for each species and for any issues or rules coming out of the species-specific FMPs to be addressed at that time. In North Carolina, since small mesh gill nets are the predominant gear used to harvest spotted sea trout, per direction of the commission, small mesh gill nets must be addressed during the review of this FMP. So the information paper presents details to guide the potential management measures discussed in the Sustainable Harvest issue paper, which includes things like how mesh size restrictions, trip limits, and yardage restrictions could be expected to impact spotted sea trout harvest and bycatch in both the spotted sea trout small mesh fishery, but also in other small mesh fisheries that harvest spotted sea trout incidentally. So the best example of both of those is striped mullet. Especially in the fall, striped mullet are the primary incidental catch in the spotted sea trout small mesh fishery, and spotted sea trout are the primary incidental catch in the striped mullet small mesh fishery. So this information paper also discusses ways to mitigate user group conflict to the greatest extent possible. And just to give a quick example of how this information paper can inform sustainable harvest, the figure here on the right is showing the relationship of stretched mesh size to the total length of spotted sea trout sampled in our commercial fish oil sampling. The solid black line is just a trend line that we show for reference. The slope of that trend line, which is how steep or shallow that is, shows the strength of the relationship between fish length and stretched mesh size. And you can see here that that slope is, the slope of the trend line isn't very steep, which means that for spotted sea trout, that relationship between length and mesh size isn't very strong. So in other words, small mesh gill nets do a pretty good job of avoiding catching sublegal spotted sea trout, but they probably don't do a great job of selectively harvesting legal spotted sea trout by size. And it's likely because of spotted sea trout body type and shape. They're a soft body fish, and larger spotted sea trout aren't necessarily deep as fish of other species. So just to kind of complete that link between the small mesh paper and sustainable harvest issue paper, this graph could be used to inform the effectiveness of using mesh size changes to try and reduce any discards that might occur from management changes. So Appendix 2 is the is the sustainable harvest issue paper. The North Carolina Fisheries Reform Act requires management measures to be implemented to address overfishing as determined by the peer-reviewed spotted sea trout stock assessment. Management measures discussed in this issue paper are quantifiable, and they're projected to meet the required reduction in spotted sea trout harvest based on the terminal year of that stock assessment. So at least a 19.9% harvest reduction is required to meet the fishing mortality or F threshold, while a 53.9% harvest reduction would be required to reach the F target. Harvest reductions in this issue paper are based on harvest from 2019 to 2022. So this graph is currently empty, but I do want to spend a little bit of time setting it up. What we're seeing here is the probability of spawning stock biomass, or SSB, staying above the SSB target under various levels of fishing mortality. So just as a reminder, fishing mortality is that rate at which fishing activities remove fish from the population. So the x-axis, which are the numbers along the bottom, start 1 year post-management implementation. And this is because we're projecting the spawning stock biomass forward based on different scenarios of harvest reduction. I do want to mention that the projections we're showing today assume that there will be no cold stuns within that projected time frame, so within those 15 years. And they assume that recruitment stays consistent. I do specifically show the probability of SSB staying above the target here, because that was the state of the spotted sea trout fishery in North Carolina in that final year of the stock assessment. And one thing that has come through loud and clear at every single step of this amendment process is that people are really happy with how many spotted sea trout they see right now. Management that keeps spawning stock biomass above the target should keep the population at those levels that folks are currently enjoying. So this red line, the solid red line there in the middle, represents a 50% chance that SSB will stay above the target. If the probability falls below 50%, it's pretty unlikely that management would succeed. The dashed black line, a little higher on the graph there, it represents a 75% chance that SSB would stay above the target. Above that line, there's a pretty high probability of the fishery continuing in its current state. Then between those two lines is probably an area that we would want to be a bit more cautious. And again, below that red line at 50, it's unlikely that we would see success. So over the next few slides, I'm going to add lines for those different rates of fishing mortality. And each line will show the probability of spotted sea trout spawning stock biomass staying above the target if that rate of fishing mortality continues. So in other words, each line is going to show the probability that the spotted sea trout fishery remains in the current state that people are happy with today. So this light blue line, the first one we're adding there, is the rate of fishing mortality in the final year of the stock assessment. So there are a lot of things that go into that rate each year, but we can kind of think of this as a snapshot of the current fishing mortality rate. If we continue harvesting spotted sea trout at this rate, projections show a pretty steep decline in SSB, with SSB likely falling below the target. Long term, there would be less than a 50% chance that SSB stays above the target. So this means there's a good chance that the rate at which we are fishing in the terminal year of the stock assessment could cause SSB to drop below the current levels, although SSB would likely remain above the threshold still. So this purple line, there it goes. represents the probability of SSB staying above the target under that threshold fishing mortality rate. So again, you might remember from a few slides ago, reducing F to the threshold would take that 19.9% harvest reduction. The probability of spawning stock biomass staying above the target eventually settles around 70% under that threshold F level. So in other words, if we reduce harvest by 19.9%, there's about a 70% chance that SSB stays above the target. And then this final black line represents the probability of SSB staying above the target if we reduce harvest to reach the target fishing mortality rate. If you remember, reducing F to the target will require that 53.9% harvest reduction that I mentioned earlier. So at the F target, the probability of SSB staying above the target level, so again, staying kind of in that level that folks are very happy with these days, is basically 100%. In other words, if we reduce harvest by 53.9%, there's a really darn good chance that SSB remains at the current level. I know there's a whole lot going on this slide, and it took a while to build to this point, but there are a few things from this graph I'd like you all to focus on. So first, under that current fishing mortality rate, it's unlikely that SSB stays at that level that folks are so happy with. Second, while the threshold fishing mortality rate does keep us above that 50% red line, it is falling into that area between 50 and 75% probability lines where we might want to be a little bit more cautious. And then finally, management that reduces F so that, or reduces harvest so that F falls somewhere in between the threshold and the target. So in between that purple and black line, we're somewhere in between 19.9 and 53.9%, should give us a really high probability of SSB staying above the target, which is kind of a perfect segue into the management options looked at in Amendment 1. So as I mentioned before, the specific management measures discussed in the Sustainable Harvest issue paper are quantifiable and projected to meet the required reduction in spotted sea trout harvest based on that stock assessment term of the year. These options have been refined based on a lot of input from the Spotted Sea Trout Advisory Committee during their spring workshop, the Spotted Sea Trout Plan Development Team, the Marine Fisheries Commission, and the copious, maybe is the word, amount of public input that we've received throughout this process. Most of our meetings have been pretty well attended, which has been awesome, because that means we get a lot of input. Options to achieve sustainable harvest include changes to size limits, season closures, changes to recreational bag limits and commercial trip limits, management of the Bogue Bank stock net fishery, and combinations of the above management measures. Current spotted sea trout management is a relatable and a good example of combination management. So it combines size limits, trip limits, and bag limits, and then area closures to commercial harvest and joint waters. So combining multiple management measures to get what we need today. So we also looked at updating the adaptive management framework in the spotted sea trout fishery management plan. Adaptive management just allows the division to adjust management measures if the management strategies that are implemented in Amendment 1 aren't achieving their intended purpose. So the management measures that can be adjusted are things like season closures, day of the week closures, bag and trip limits, size limits, and then gear restrictions in support of those. And that process starts with the division evaluating the management strategy that was implemented. And we do that through things like our indices of abundance, the length frequencies of fish in our independent and dependent sampling, and then the age structure of fish from our independent and dependent sampling. So all those metrics that I just mentioned, we report those every year in our annual FMB. If those metrics kind of make it look like, and not kind of, if it looks like the management strategies implemented in Amendment 1 are not achieving sustainable harvest based on those metrics, then the division can revise that management strategy using adaptive management. And really, that's a lot of words to describe something that just makes the process move a little bit faster in between stock assessment updates. With an amendment like this to the fishery management plan, it on purpose takes some time. We want to get a lot of input. We want to hear from as many people as we possibly can But there are instances where being able to move a little bit faster would probably benefit the stock more. And, let us in the long term not have to do quite as heavy of a lift. Adaptive management is that tool basically. So these next two slides are adapted from table 2.9 in appendix 2, and that table is on page 64 of the amendment 1 draft. So table 2.9 summarizes the management options presented in the sustainable harvest issue paper. And I've highlighted the division's preliminary management recommendation on these slides, but all these options are presented in a lot more detail in appendix 2. So there are options for changes to the minimum and maximum size limit and season closures. There are also options for changes to the recreational bag and commercial trip limits, management of the boat bank stop net fishery, combinations of individual management options, and again, that updated adaptive management framework. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Melinda, and she's going to go over the rest of the issue papers and then the division's initial management recommendations.
All right, thanks, Lucas. I'll start with Appendix 3, which looks at supplemental management options for spotted sea trout. Supplemental options are those ideas that would probably benefit the population, but the extent of that benefit isn't quantifiable. It's not something you can calculate. These supplemental management options include things like vessel limits. Vessel limits could be used to limit the number of spotted sea trout harvested per vessel, or could be used to limit or eliminate the captain crew allowance on for-hire trips. They also include effort controls. In theory, effort controls could be used to limit entry into the spotted sea trout fishery, but the bar to limit entry into a fishery is very high, and it's unlikely that the spotted sea trout fishery reaches or meets that bar. Gear requirements, like requiring circle hooks with live or natural baits, eliminating treble hooks, or requiring rubberized landing nets, and tournaments. The possibility of regulating fishing tournaments in some manner are also discussed in this issue paper. Both gear requirements and regulating tournaments are complicated only because implementing management for these in the spotted sea trout fishery would likely affect a variety of other fisheries as well. And finally, this issue paper also discusses the commercial hook and line harvest of spotted sea trout. This is another idea where management could have widespread effects beyond the spotted sea trout fishery. Appendix 3 again discusses all of these options at length and discusses DMF's initial recommendations. This slide is adapted from table 3.2 in Appendix 3, which can be found on page 74 of the amendment draft, and summarizes the management options in the supplemental harvest issue paper. Again, the preliminary division recommendation here is highlighted with blue boxes. These options are discussed again in more detail in Appendix 3 and include options for a vessel limit and for eliminating the for-hire captain crew allowance for spotted sea trout. The final appendix we will review tonight is Appendix 4, which looks at management in the event of a severe cold stun. Currently, the director can close the spotted sea trout fishery by proclamation through June 15th in the event of a severe cold stun, which allows surviving fish a chance to spawn before they are subject to harvest. This issue paper discusses additional management options on top of that seasonal closure through June 15th. So management options include extending that seasonal closure through more of the spawning season, include size limits, commercial trip and recreational bag limits, or an adaptive management framework, which would allow the director more flexibility in reacting to those severe cold stuns. The adaptive management framework would allow the division to adjust management measures if a cold stun were especially severe. Management measures that could be adjusted through this cold stun adaptive management specifically include temporary measures like season closures, day of the week closures, bag and trip limits, size limits, and gill net yardage restrictions. The cold stun adaptive management process would start with the division evaluating the cold stun by analyzing water temperatures, reviewing cold stun reports, using on-site data collected by division staff. It would also include the analysis of our fisheries independent data, looking at the indices of abundance and length frequencies from our sampling. If a cold stun was deemed especially severe, then the director can implement a temporary management measure using this adaptive management. So this slide is adapted from table 4.1 of Appendix 4 with the preliminary division recommendation highlighted in blue. This table can be found on page 83 of the draft of Amendment 1 and summarizes the management options in the Cold Stun issue paper, Cold Stun management issue paper. These options again include extending that season closure, size limits, bag and trip limits, and adapting the adopted management framework. So we include the preliminary DMF management recommendations in the draft amendment. So the public and so standing advisory committees can provide their specific input on these recommendations. Much like the options considered in each of the issue papers, these recommendations were defined using input from the Spotted Sea Trout Advisory Committee and the MFC. In developing these recommendations, we considered management across both the spotted sea trout and striped mullet fisheries because of the similarities in seasonality and gear types between those two fisheries. We also aim to strike a balance between access to the fishery for both sectors, the potential for recoupment of harvest, the biology of spotted sea trout, taking into account the necessary reductions to end overfishing, and maintaining the current abundance of spotted sea trout available. I will reiterate, this is still the drafting stage of Amendment 1. The amendment, including our preliminary recommendations, are subject to change based on the input we receive from the public and the standing and regional advisory committees. So starting with Appendix 2, the Sustainable Harvest Issue Paper. Remember that management measures discussed in this issue paper are quantifiable and are projected to meet the required reduction in the spotted sea trout harvest based on the terminal year of the stock assessment. The preliminary DMF management recommendation to achieve sustainable harvest is for a January through February statewide closure, harvest closure for both sectors, a 14 to 20 inch recreational slot limit with an allowance for 1 fish over 26 inches, a 3 fish recreational bag limit, and a commercial harvest closure from 11:59 p.m. Friday to 12:01 a.m. Tuesday, October through December. This mirrors that fall weekend closure recently adopted in Amendment 2 of the striped mullet FMP. Additionally, the preliminary division management recommendation is for no changes to the quota in the boat bank stop net fishery, but to formalize that management of that fishery in Amendment 1. And finally, the preliminary division recommendation is to adopt the adaptive management framework to allow the division to respond more quickly to ensure sustainability goals are met. As Lucas mentioned before, the spotted sea trout fishery is recreationally dominated. Since current management was put into place in 2012, recreational harvest has accounted for about 86% of total harvest, and commercial has accounted for about 14%. So here we're showing the reductions in pounds of harvest and percent for each sector, as well as the total harvest reduction we expected from the preliminary recommendations. Pounds of harvest is based on that average harvest from 2019 to 2022. The preliminary recommendations from that previous slide would result in a recreational harvest reduction of just over 1.3 million pounds or 39.5%, while the commercial harvest would be reduced by about 228,000 pounds or 40.2%. This would combine to a total harvest reduction of 39.6%. When we look at the breakdown of each sector's contribution to that total harvest reduction, we see that it aligns almost exactly with the proportion of total harvest, making these reductions equitable. The preliminary division recommendation in Appendix 3 is to eliminate the captain crew allowance for spotted sea trout. This idea did have support from the for-hire industry and would stop the practice of harvesting multiple captain crew limits in a day. The preliminary division recommendation for cold stun management is to extend that harvest closure in the event of a severe cold stun through June 30th and adopting the cold stun adaptive management framework. Extending the closure through June 30th just protects those spotted sea trout that survive the cold stun through the entirety of that peak and spawning, or that first peak and spawning. The adaptive management framework would also allow the division flexibility in responding to an exceptionally bad cold stun. Finally, I would like to remind everyone again of where we are in the FMP process. As we've mentioned a couple times today, the Amendment 1 draft and the preliminary recommendations included in it are still in the drafting stage and subject to change based on the input we received from you all and the public. The action item today is for the advisory committee to vote on management recommendations to deliver to the Marine Fisheries Commission. We will deliver this recommendation to the MFC at their November meeting, where they will select their preferred management option. At this point, we are happy to answer any questions you might have about the presentation today or Amendment 1 to the Spotted Sea Trout Fishery Management Plan.
I have a couple of, Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of questions. Appreciate your presentation. This is a couple of small items before I'd like to address something better. In the stock assessment, and I don't know if you have access to it, one of the things that I thought was quite noteworthy was the predicted abundance of the beginning of the year from the base model of the stock assessment, giving the abundance of the size classes over the years. And you folks are always looking for that trend where you're seeing if there's a decline in age classes over time, there's trouble. You take a look at this figure 3.26 to be brought up. Actually, from 1990 up to 2019, there's been really a significant increase in the age structure of our population, which I think is a good thing. I'm just bringing that up, whether you have seen that or whether you, because in many of the meetings I've attended, the age structure of the population is always a very, very important thing to look at. I just bring that up. The other thing I had asked was, looking at the program 915 data, in 2008 and 19, there was a fairly high relative abundance. Did that follow through in 2020 and 23?
So in 20, yes, I would have to, yeah, okay. I'm just gonna pull it up. So yes, it would, 20 is a hard one, because I remember, we actually have a sample.
Yes.
So, in the spring index, so that index is split into two parts in the stock assessment. There's a fall relative abundance index.
Yeah, I was thinking
spring.
of the program 915.
Yeah, those both come from program 915. That's how it's treated in the stock assessment, is a fall index and a spring index. The idea behind that is the fall index will pick up that recruitment signature. The spring index will pick up that winter mortality signature. So 2020, there's a gap in both of those. And then in 2021, there's a gap in that spring index. And that's just the timing of when that started back up.
So what do you see the trend in terms of relative abundance based on the program 915? Is it fairly increasing trend since?
So it's lower every year that we have data for since 2019. 2019 was the time series high. It's no year got up quite that high. 2023 was the second highest value in that time series. So it's we still see abundance is relatively high as measured by that.
This is relatively important.
Yep.
And the reason I bring this up, and I'm sure you folks have read the peer review by Murphy and by Joe Hightower. I mean, one of the things that they talk in there is this, there are constraints and limitations with this stock assessment. And I'm sure there's not enough time to go over that, but there are some constraints. But what they talk about is a gradual, to manage this thing gradually, because you can't control cold stunts. Major problem that's not been addressed here is recreational discards. And that's my major concern. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, are you going to consider a gradual a management process, or are you going to just throw this stuff that you have up there out?
So
Making sense?
you're talking like.
I'm talking about from the peer review.
Yeah.
Comment by Hightower and Murphy.
So I do think there is an important piece of context to the conversation around that, because you're right, you're absolutely right. They did suggest gradual stable management. But a lot of the conversation around that had to do with the fact that 2019, at the time we were sitting in that meeting, that peer review workshop, was the time series high, and there wasn't another year that was really even close as far as removals. That's no longer the case. We've now had definitely 4 of the last 5 years, potentially 5 of the last 6 years, that have removals at a very similar level. So a little bit lower, sure. We're looking at total removals. Some of those years are very, very close. But even just looking at harvest, well above the time series average. So a lot of that conversation had to do with the variability in F in that terminal year, which is pretty common in a stock assessment. To have the less data that's available, the harder it is for the model to pick those things up. But also had to do with the fact that 2019 at that point was a pretty massive outlier. It's not a massive outlier anymore. Now, I can't say whether the peer review panel would still, looking at the data that we have since then, give that same suggestion. Updating the stock assessment would be problematic with no stock assessment scientists on staff. And their other recommendation was to not look at updating that assessment until we had enough time after that data gap from.
So this is why they recommend this kind of a gradual approach, and particularly looking at P915 data. So, and I know I'm taking up too much time, and I apologize.
We're absolutely not taking up time.
I'd like to. I had prior to this meeting and prior to the Marine Fish Commission meeting, I had sent some comments to some of the commissioners, and I'd like to just, if I could, just throw out some of these things that occurred in that peer review by Murphy and Hightower. Said recreational discards have increased dramatically in recent years, and estimated dead discards account for a significant fraction of removals relative to the gillnet fishery. This fishery is a very small component of the total fishery take. Murphy and Hightower, again, we suggest a lower emphasis on commercial monitoring for this species because of the relatively minor impact of commercial fishing on the stock. Recreational discards should be the primary focus, parentheses, and high rather than low priority because of the trend and magnitude of recreational catch and release. I may have missed something, but I have not seen that being discussed. What is DMF? How are they going to address this discard mortality?
So in that portion of the stock assessment, they were speaking specifically to our research priorities coming out of the stock assessment, one of which was to have a better characterization of commercial discards in the runaround gillnet fishery, because we don't have one. Their point there was, don't focus on that as much because it's a very small portion of the fishery. What we want is a better characterization of recreational discards. So things like length, things like disposition, why people are discarding fish, things along those lines. My understanding of that, in my recollection of those conversations, I was in the room when those conversations were happening, was much more surrounding our research priorities as listed in the stock assessment. And we adjusted those based on those recommendations. If you look at those research priorities coming out of it, characterizing commercial dead discards are pretty low on the priority list. as far as being able to better characterize recreational discards, that's a tough nut to crack. We don't see those discards. We don't get a lot of information about those discards.
Well, your recreational data does not include discard mortality. The recreational data, I think, just is the harvest. It's not taken into account.
So recreational data does, you're talking like the data that Emirates provides?
Yes.
Yeah, no, there's an estimate of discards with Emirates. Now, it doesn't provide an estimate of dead discards. We use a hook and line mortality study that occurred here in North Carolina, which gave us an estimate on average of a 10% discard mortality rate, which that's then applied to the total discards. So we get a total discards from Emory. We apply a discard mortality rate to that to give us an estimate of dead discards.
Yeah, I might have a little bit of a disagreement with you that you talked about the comments that I made about not really dealing, not necessarily with the commercial, because it's such a, really doesn't make any major difference. These discard mortalities do. And that's really, it's not in the way I read it, it's not in the research recommendations. It's in the first page of this review. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is I just don't see this being addressed. It's a tremendous challenge. You can't predict cold stunts. It's a major thing. The challenge, I think, for DMF is how do you eliminate recreational discard mortalities? You know, everybody in this room knows that there's not going to be less recreational fishermen in the future. I mean, I've lived on Sleepy Creek and down east for 53 years. And I'll tell you, there's a few more people out fishing when I came here
Just one or two.
than there are in 2000.
I don't doubt that.
I mean, so I don't think that, I think that's going to continue.
Yeah.
And so my major problem is I know it's a challenge, but I don't think it's being addressed. And here you are, you're putting a 40% closing a commercial fishery down for 3 days when it has relatively little impact on F. There's something wrong here, and I'm not picking on any individuals or something like that, but I just can't understand it, and I personally can't vote for anything like that.
And Alan, I'm gonna go a step further that, you know, they're not just closing it down for 3 days. They want a partial weekend closure, plus they want to take 2 months. You know, they're talking about January and February also. And, you know, my thing is, I was on the first speckled trout committee they ever had. Been on the commission before. I'm back on the commission now. I've been on I've been on every committee this place has got. So spawning stock biomass is high, probably as high as it's ever been. Okay. I don't know that I've ever seen any stock we've ever dealt with that's got a higher spawning stock biomass than what this does. Overfishing is not occurring, but we're just above the overfished mark.
Flip
Okay.
that.
Okay, I'm
We're
sorry.
not overfished.
Okay,
We're
yeah,
just
there you go.
overfished.
Yeah, flip it. You're right. Okay, so with that, you know, now you're gonna ask for a 40% reduction, not only from commercial, but for recreation. You know, and so what are we gonna do if we got something that's not overfished? And it's got a great spawning stock biomass, and we start asking for a 40% reduction. So what are we gonna do when we come back in here to a stock that has a problem? What are we gonna do? We gonna completely close it down like we did flounder? I mean, I think that just seems the way we're moving with everything. You know, and I've talked with you on the phone at great lengths, you know, and yeah, do I think, you know, I'm always willing to do something, you know, and like I told you, on the commercial side, we could mirror the roe mullet fishery, because those fish are caught together. I mean, if you're catching one, you're gonna catch the other, and yet when you're completely catching roe mullets, you don't catch as many speckled trout. But in the wintertime, when you're catching winter mullets, you are gonna catch a few speckled trout. And, so if I'm still catching winter mullets in January and February, all right, I think if you look at the total discard mortality in the commercial fishery, which we keep our fish and sell them, you know, what is it? It's 1%, one in three. I mean, it's
Pretty low.
very, very low. So if we close January and February for the commercial fishery, then all of a sudden, while we're catching mullets, we're gonna make that discard mortality rate, it could be 10, 12, 15% on a fish that we don't really have a problem with in that area. And if we closed it to mirror the speckled trout fishery, you know, you're talking about getting 31%, what, 31.2, 31.5, or something like that.
I can look.
Talked about it.
It was around there.
Yeah, it's right around there, between 30 and 32%. How about that? And I mean, to me, that's a logical thing to do, because I don't want to have the commercial fishery come in and all of a sudden have a huge discard mortality, because right now, you know, I feel for the recreational side, because they got a huge discard mortality and they've got a huge dead discard mortality, and there's no way to stop that. I mean, unless somebody tried to say, you know, hey, we're gonna not let anybody carry a rod and reel. And I told you this, we're not gonna let anybody carry a rod and reel on the boat in November, and you can't fish no more. And that's never gonna happen, because that's stupider than anything I've said up here. You know, so for us to try to chase the dead discard mortality in the rod and reel fishery, you know, I think we're chasing our tail and we're not gonna get anywhere. But you know, I think if we sit here and try to come up with a reasonable reduction that everybody can live with, and I know on the commercial side, there's a lot of people gonna say, oh man, I can't believe they closed speckled trout on the weekend too. But I think that by doing that, we don't make our dead discard mortality go through the roof the next time we're sitting in one of these. Now, you know, on the recreational side, you know, I'm hoping when we listen to public comments, maybe somebody out there has a good suggestion, you know, for how to do something with that also. But, and that's why I love to have the public comment right after we do a little discussion, so we can discuss more before we vote. And, Mr. Proctor.
I have a question on recreational discard mortality. This is just anecdotal.
Mhm.
I fish a lot for trout. I really do. And I moved to Newbern 3 years ago. Now I really fish a lot. And I have some opinions I've gained, like above the ferry line. It's a lot better. But my question on the mortality is, we had a period for like almost a solid month where those fish were all around the Bridgeton Bridge over the news. I mean, everybody's catching all the trout they wanted. Okay. I never once saw a dead trout. I don't see where the mortality comes from. And I can say other places too, where I see the fishing's on fire and I don't see any mortality. I mean, do they sink to the bottom, or I don't?
They do. Well,
Is that what happens?
They do, but I don't know that it's as high as what they say it is. I'm gonna agree with you on that. I don't think it's nowhere near as high as it is.
Looking at two different things here. We're looking at two different things here. You're looking at the total number of estimated recreational dead discards. And then you're talking about a discard mortality rate. So the discard mortality rate for spotted sea trout is very low. It's about 10%. So the flip side of that is 90% of the fish that are released survive just fine. 10% of them though, and it's mostly the fish that are gut hooked. It's the biggest indicator of whether that fish is going to live or not. It's the fish that are gut hooked.
Yeah.
But when you were talking about the sheer number of recreational anglers on the, I mean, you said it yourself, are hammering. When you're talking about a sheer number, you applied 10% to a really big number, and your resulting number is pretty big. But the vast majority of fish that people catch, the overwhelming majority of them swim away just fine. And they're,
I can see what you're saying, because less experienced fishermen would tend to gut hook them more than an experienced fisherman, because, you know, experienced trout fish, we don't gut hook fish typically. And can't even remember. But I can see how someone putting on a bait shrimp, but he doesn't.
Mr. Carl.
You know, we're talking about this mortality, but I don't know that you've got a real good handle on that, whether that 10% number is any good. You're gonna have a lot of variation in release mortality depending on water temperature, oxygen level, size of the fish, as well as how they're hooked. And you've got that way down the priority list. It would probably be quite extensive effort to get a better handle on that, but I think that's very important to come into this whole formula, particularly if we're cutting back on the take or the proposed take. That means there's going to be more caught and released. And if we don't have a good handle on that, he is saying it's underestimated. Well, it might be underestimated, but it might be overestimated too. And my concern is that I don't see the solid data to explain that, particularly with the variations that I mentioned, the oxygen, the temperature, the size of the fish, the area.
so spotted sea trout discard mortality is pretty well studied. There are studies right here in North Carolina, there are studies all down the Atlantic coast, and there are studies all throughout the Gulf of Mexico. Every single one of those studies looks at those metrics. You know, we considered temperature, we considered dissolved oxygen, we considered salinity. We looked at all of those things. We looked at the size of the fish. The two things that were significant in that, again, this was a study that happened right here in North Carolina. Looking at all of those things, two things that were significant. There was a tiny effect based on size. So smaller fish, a very, if I'm remembering correctly, a very slightly higher mortality rate. But the biggest environmental thing was salinity. And we absolutely took that into account when we estimated that discard mortality rate. What that averaged out to, the combination of salinity and hooking injuries averaged out to 10%. If you break it down to the actual salinity, there's a slightly lower discard mortality rate in higher salinity areas and a slightly higher discard mortality rate in lower salinity areas. But we absolutely took those things into account with our discard mortality.
So if we could, let's get some public comment and then let's discuss this again and see if we can come up with a motion of some kind. And as my buddy, the Colonel, comes up, and he used to be my captain in my area. Then he left us and went to Morehead City.
Just came back home.
Okay. And so Rob Bizzle used to say, I can butcher a name better than anybody, but he can't butcher one no better than me. So I apologize before I ever start. Okay. So we got Art. I'm not even going to try. How do you say that?
Excuse me, Fingelstead.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I'd like to say a couple of things.
If you can come up and sit in this chair up here, just so our microphone picks you up.
Yeah, we're going to put you in the spotlight.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I think one of the things that there's a fair amount of heartburn about is this notion of percentages, okay? 10% of a big number is a lot bigger than 10% of a little number. So that means that folks that are having the big impact, that are gonna have approximately the same impact, I mean, your plan has it set to be almost the same number statistically. That means that the recreational folks are going to be paying a bigger price than the commercial guys are in this context. It's just going to be harder. They have to have a bigger reduction as far as the number of fish. That's all there is to it. I personally think that you guys ought to really seriously consider making these guys that game fish. I mean, you look at 86% of the people are recommending to the legislature or whatever, 86% of the fishing that goes on is recreational. So it's not really, to me, it's a slam dunk for it to be recreational than it is to be commercial or anything, or not classified. So look at the statistics carefully, make sure we're not overweighting things percentage wise, and go with game fish. Thank you.
Tim Hargenreiter.
It seems like to me that the number of fishermen are overwhelming the fishery. There's just too many fishermen all the way around. I don't see how you get around that. Population's growing. There's just more fishermen all the time. So we've got to come to a come to Jesus meeting somewhere along the line and figure out how the hell we're going to figure this out, because it's getting out of control. And you just said yourself, we're going to get to the point where we got to close it down, just like we did the flounder. What we're doing tonight is bickering over the crumbs of a once vibrant marine fisheries resource. Spots, croakers, weakfish, all once staples of commercial and recreational anglers alike, left decimated by the commercial fishing industry's shrimp trawling. Flounder devastated by commercial large mesh nets and a commercial industry that opposed any meaningful changes for more than 20 years, knowing full well the flounder were overfished, with overfishing continuing. Why am I saying that? Because it's focused. There's less desirable fish out there to fish for. These boat spots and croakers, where they fish, they're not around anymore. I remember in the old days, the coast was lined with people fishing for spot. Croaker were very important, both to the commercials and the recreationals. They're gone now. So what have we got left? Now it's the spotted sea trout's turn. Specs have long been primarily a recreational fishery, no longer. With the demise of the flounder, the commercials are fishing down the food chain. Harvest has gone from 250,000 pounds per year to 600,000 pounds in 4 years. Recreational angling pressure has increased as well. Is it any wonder? There's more people. Population's growing exponentially. There's just more fishermen entering the fishery. And they're finding 1 red drum and 4 specks a day. That's all that's left for us. What I'm hearing in here tonight is dead discards as a culprit. DMF, I believe, has been using 10% dead discards forever in their management formulas, if I'm not mistaken. 10%, by the way, is also used in largemouth bass formulas. It's a universally used in fisheries management figure, 10%. What is not being used is latent licenses. How can any fisheries manager propose meaningful regulations for commercial fishermen when they don't know how many fishermen are fishing? My preferences for commercials include DMF, MFC requests the legislature designate specs of game fish. That will take time. In the interim, declare specs a hook and line fishery with, say, a 15 fish limit, 16-inch size limit with very limited entry, and get a handle on the
That's your time, sir.
latent license.
All right, that's your time.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah.
Donald Willis?
Sammy, do you mind if I just clarify something real?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Discard mortality rate, again, that is a specific discard mortality rate to spotted sea trout based on a study conducted right here in North Carolina. It's not a generic number. It's not a number we picked out of a hat. It does track pretty closely with a lot of other spotted sea trout discard mortality studies, but it is definitely specific to spotted sea trout. Sorry.
Go ahead, Donald.
My name is Donald Willis. I've made my living off the recreational fishery for my whole life. Night on spotted sea trout. Let's look at everybody that's got spotted sea trout, from Texas up through Virginia. About half of these states have realized the economic engine that speckled trout is and made it game fish. All but 2 beyond that have a limited entry hook and line fishery, very limited entry, and they have a cap on it. The two states that are left are North Carolina and Virginia. Virginia has a gill net fishery, but has a cap on it. What do we have? We don't have game fish. We don't have a limited entry of any kind, and we don't have a cap on the fishing. We've seen exponential growth in the commercial fishery, and we haven't done anything to fix this. No guardrails, nothing to stop that end of it. I mean, we're talking a fishery in 2022 that was worth over $500 million in economic impact from recreational fishery in North Carolina. Other states have figured this out. They protected this fish. It's worth way more to the states to protect this fish than it is to waste it. Almost every trout sold on the national market comes out of North Carolina. Let that sink in. There's a lot going on here. We need to protect these fish. We need to do what's right for the state of North Carolina. At least let's put a cap on it, make it a generous cap, but it's something that we need to do to stop the just vulnerable fish from being hit harder than we really wanted to. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Let's see. It's Stuart Creighton. What's the first name?
Stu, right? Yeah.
See, I know who you are.
All right, guys, I didn't write anything up tonight, but there are a few things that do need to be brought about. First of all, as a member of the Spotted Sea Trout AC, I really think that the recreational recommendations that they made were pretty well spot on. In that case, it was a 16 to 20 inch slot, still with 4 fish, plus an allowance for 1/24. That reduction was right about 33%, which is a little bit short of the division recommendations, close to 40. But the kicker there is there was no closure and you're still allowed to keep your 4 fish. Yes, it was a narrow slot. Yes, I realize there will be issues with that, but you're keeping access to the fish all year long. Something that has got to be emphasized because you already heard it a couple of times. You're probably going to hear it a couple of times more. No striped bass, no flounder, 1 red. You're getting closed out of everything, and go fish. I'm not talking about in the ocean now. Go fish the wintertime rivers. What are you going to see? Stripers, a few slot drum, maybe speckled trout. Close the trout. You closed an industry, 2 months. I don't think that's wise. We heard a lot tonight about the recreational discard problem. I made this comment at the last MFC meeting. Circle hooks, inline hooks for natural bait only, whether it's live or cut bait, whatever, will reduce those discards. I understand that it will not be necessarily quantifiable. That doesn't mean the benefit won't be there. Doesn't mean it's not worth taking a shot. The division can go into some educational component, one of their main tenets, with rubberized nets, voluntarily compressing your barbs on treble hooks, voluntarily replacing the treble hooks with inline hooks. That can all be done as an educational component to get the word out, much like the release over 20. We all know that program had significant benefit to the specific speckled trout fishery. So bear that in mind. The captain's share removal and the increasing the cold stone protocols to June 30th, that's fine. That's good stuff. That's not going to hurt a thing. Commercial industry is always sticky. The advisory committee did recommend a January through March closure on the commercial trout fishery. That was a slightly less than the 40% that you saw there. If that's unpalatable, then perhaps a 350, 375,000 pound quota on speckled trout. That's more than the traditional fishery, but still gets the reduction you're looking for.
And Moses?
Moses.
Moses.
Yes.
Thanks for the opportunity to address you guys tonight. I've got some written statements and then I'd like to make just a couple other comments if I've got time. I'm the president of the Eastern Carolina Saltwater Fishing Club of New Bern. As you know, the advisory committee spent 3 days developing a proposal to address the issues with this fishery. The proposal was a good compromise to how to address the issue that trout may be in a status where overfishing is occurring. With the establishment of a slot limit and the krill limit still at 4 fish, the plan seemed to resolve the issues of overfishing and reach the required reduction without a seasonal closure. As we saw with the attempt to address the flounder issue, with a complete seasonal closure, we are now seeing draft proposals that make the same attempt to enact a seasonal closure on spotted sea trout in January and February. Since trout are the only fish in our local rivers and creeks during those months, the closure essentially shuts down the opportunity for recreational fishermen to harvest any fish for their own use. As we have seen with the closure on the flounder fishery, recreational fishermen are going to continue to fish and catch flounder because they exist in the same waters as trout, drum, striped bass, and other fish species. It will be the same with spotted sea trout even during the seasonal closure. A closure only affects the ability to take fish home. It doesn't affect the numbers of fishermen on the water or the species caught, nor does it decrease any significant numbers of dead discards. It makes recreational fishermen wonder what the point of ever buying a fishing license is when you become so restricted on what fish you're allowed to harvest. I would hope that the original proposal put forth by the advisory committee be reconsidered in its entirety. We also need to interact the adaptive management system, which we've talked about tonight, which would allow us to adjust annually and not wait for a 5-year assessment, which will surely result in complete closure of the spotted sea trout fishery. If these actions are put in place, I believe the required reductions necessary to sustain our spotted sea trout fishery without the negative effects of a seasonal closure can be accomplished. The other comment that I'd just like to make when we were talking about the dead discards, I've fished for trout for a long time, and I would say probably 98 to 99% of the trout that I've ever caught are hooked in the lip. If they're put back in the water, I would say that they were probably survivable fish. Much different than flounder. A lot of times you hook flounder in their gut hook. Spotted sea trout do not very seldom ever get gutted hooked. I don't see how 10% can be anywhere near
Your time, sir.
of any kind of dead discard.
Jeremy Bailey, is that?
Ready. I would like to start by saying, I think it is ridiculous that we are even here today talking about limiting another fishery. And I tell you why. We are North Carolina and we have 2.2 million acres of estuary, one of the largest in the United States. But yet we are one of the strictest fisheries. I ask you why? Not because any group is catching all of them. It's because fisheries are producing bad science. It's all theoretical. And wants everyone to argue about allocations. While everyone is arguing about allocations, the fact remains there are plenty of fish, plenty of speckled trout. I personally eat fish, like most fishermen, but what do I have left? What do you have left? You start talking about taking trout from us. You got one drum, one gray, no flounder, no striped bass. Does DMF want everybody to become outlaws? That's what's going to happen when you can't keep any of the fish out of a 2.2 million acre estuary and don't believe the state agencies. How can DMF even pretend to know fish estimates in an estuary this big? I tell you, they can't. And they are doing a bad job predicting any stock assessments. Everyone I know is catching more and bigger fish than they ever have before. Please open your mind and question all of the theoretical science and theoretical stock assessments. What does the future hold for my kids? A bunch of fish nobody can keep and eat. Leave the fishery as is and allow us to keep fresh fish. Everything presented was theoretical. Everybody has heard these similar presentations and that hasn't come true. The truth is there's more fish than there ever has been before. Thank you. I'm probably, and I'm just gonna be biased to myself. I'm probably the best advocate because I love the recreational, I love the commercial. Okay? I'm the only one that's gonna speak to you on that side of it because I do both. Okay, and my point is a couple things, and I'm gonna give you a recommendation because it is radical. My recommendation is because you've made radical decisions. Marine Fisheries has made radical decisions. Their decisions on closures of all the fish that we've got. I was born, raised on the water, walked on the water, walked down the shoreline every morning looking for soft shells, looking for flounder, looking for things, hook and line fish, raised fishing with nets. Okay, I love it both. And the problem is what your data, a lot of the inland, the data that you're doing about recreational is inland and joint waters. It's not fair to recreational, hands down. It's not fair. You ain't got no room to argue about that because it's not in your boundaries. Your boundaries should be coastal. Stick to what you're supposed to stick to. There is a separation. You need to have wildlife in here to help give some recommendations of what is inland and who is fishing and who ain't fishing. Your data's flawed a lot. Gill mesh, stuff like that. You don't know what gill mesh people are using. You don't know how many times I've been fishing. You have none. That's spectating. How many afternoons I went out there 2 hours? Or did I go fishing 5 times last week because it was nice? Okay. You don't have, your data is so flawed and it's wrong. And what it's done is it's proved that in history, that the heron, the rockfish, everything I love. I love the heron. I love the rockfish. I love to go pull a shrimp and get my own damn shrimp. Okay. I love to go get my trout and go feed to my daughter. I love for her to catch it. She caught her first speckled trout 2 weeks ago in my boat. We took it home. We ate it. I love to eat fish. I don't love to throw them back. I went the same next day and caught 4 fish, and then I went home. I had no discards. The same thing if I go drop a net. I have very few, if any, discards that are undersized. My recommendations to you is we really need to shut down this committee. We need to really let marine fisheries suffer in their own slobber, in their own slop, because they have made radical decisions that has not benefited anybody from a recreational standpoint or a commercial standpoint. You've done nothing but destroy it. My thoughts in my mind, and I have brought up to a lot of people, is I would love, in my mind, I would move, but I can't. My passion is that water out there, and you're taking it away slowly, slowly. Okay, I've paid for all my license. I've paid for my dues. I've paid well over 100,000 in boats, tackle, gear, and everything. A lot of gear I can't even use no more. Okay, my recommendation again is to dismantle it. Okay, you need to focus on water quality. Y'all are focusing on blaming the damn fishermen. You're blaming recreational. You're blaming commercial. We're playing this little fight game. I'm right here in between. Blame me if you want to. Okay, I don't give a crap.
This one's got 2 question marks beside it. Pete,
With me.
Pete,
He just said pretty much what I think.
okay. How about Herb? Pronounce your last name for me.
Schmidt.
Okay.
My name is Herb Schmidt. I'm a member of the Eastern Carolina Saltwater Fishing Club in New Bern. I fished most of my life. I'm originally from the Northeast. I moved down here about 10 years ago. Haven't really fished too much. I joined a club to meet some new people and try to catch some fish that I never caught before. So I did that about 1.5 years ago. I don't have any charts. I don't have anything that I pre-prepared, so I'm kind of ad-libbing this. So, but at the end of the day, my whole thing is this: is if you notice a lot of the people that are in the room in the back, and I'm no disrespect to anybody sitting back there, but most of us are a little bit longer in the tooth, right? I just want some time to go out and spend the day on the water, enjoy myself, and catch something. I got to be honest with you. 80 to 90% of all the fish I catch, I release. I don't care what species they are. I let them go. I do occasionally take the fish that I want to eat or give it to a friend or whatever, but I'm not going out there trying to sink the boat with all the fish that I catch. And I don't rely on catching fish because if I did, I would probably starve. But, you know, I just want to go out there and enjoy it. Like a lot of people have already said, as a recreational fisherman, if I ever added up money I spent over the years in tackle and charter trips and party boat trips and gas and motel fees and all that stuff to stay there, that's a lot of money that goes back into the local economy when you do that. And a lot of us have friends that may come out from out of state that want to fish here. I've gone and fished out of state, out of country and stuff, spent a lot of money when I go to fish. So I'm just looking for some time to enjoy. I don't want to put any commercial fishermen out of business. But I also think we should find a way to equally share the resource, and hopefully we can also pass it on. I don't have any children or grandchildren. Hopefully we can pass that on to future generations so they can enjoy it too. So thank you for listening.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mark?
Hey, everybody, I'm Mark Stokes. I've hunted and fished my whole life, and I love trout fishing, flounder gigging. And I got more questions than responses, pretty much. Hang on one second. The metric tons of trout, how many were sold commercially in 2022? What I have is, I just got more questions, and I'm not against the commercial guys at all. What I've got is 274 metric tons. The closest state to us is Virginia at 34 metric tons. The next state closest to that is Mississippi, 13 metric tons. So you see how much higher North Carolina is than every other state. And 21 metric tons, North Carolina was 315 metric tons. Virginia was there again second, 24 metric tons. 315 to 24 metric tons. That's 21, 22. And now I go to 20. North Carolina. No, I'm sorry. 2019, 258 metric tons. The next state, again, Virginia, 31 metric tons. Why is North Carolina selling so much more fish? And flounder is representative of this same statistic right here. Why is North Carolina selling so many more metric tons than any other state? Do you know?
I mean, for spotted sea trout, there's no.
I mean, it's not even a comparison, but I can't keep 4 fish. Trying to reduce it to 3 fish. And our state sells more metric tons than any other state, hands down. And I'm not against the commercial guy. I love those guys. But I would like to take home some fish. I would like family members to come and be able to catch some fish and take home. I do not think the recreational fishing is 80% like you guys say, but you guys know more than I do. I know what I see in the field, and I've done this my whole life, and I know commercial guys too. I just want to say that's all I have to say. Why is North Carolina, hands down, not close, but far exceeding everybody else? And we're sitting here talking about restricting recreational fishing. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to? Okay. All right, with that, that ends the public comment section. So kind of, yes, sir.
So you were saying earlier how you feel like it's unfair that they're restricting months you can fish commercially for sea trout, days of the week, etc. Why does the division choose to go that route instead of saying, all right, if we caught 600,000 pounds last year, I'm just making this up, and we want to reduce it by 20%, you fish as you want until we get to whatever 20% less is of 600,000 pounds.
And so the division's biggest problem in all of this is, so let's say that we did, we let the commercial mirror the striped mullet, and we got 30% there, and we did what the speckled trout committee wanted with the 4 fish and the 16, 20, and 1 fish over 26, and say live bait, circle hook, which we can't get a quantification for, but I think everybody with half a brain knows that'll help. You know, and say we did something like that and we said, okay, we gave 31% from the commercial, 31% from the rec. We got a fishery that's not in terrible shape. That's really a good, that's better than any reduction we did on any other fish that we've started this process with. And then in January, we get 9 days that are 20 degrees. And then we come back here and we sit in this room next year and you look at that graph and we don't have any fish. The reason we've had the best years we've had over the last 4 or 5 years is because it's been that long since we've had a cold stun. These fish are managed by a cold stun. It really, you know, in one dumb ass crabber's opinion, you know, and I've been doing this a long time on these committees, you know, speckled trout would be the hardest fish I could think of to manage because whatever you do to it, it don't take but 10 cold days and it's done. And I don't care how many times North Carolina State turns the temperature down in the tank and turns it back up in 24 hours and says, oh yeah, they live and they go on and move around. But when we get a cold stun out here, it don't get warm in 24 hours. Sometimes it's 18, 20 days. They're not going to live. You know, when we get a cold stun, those fish die. Yeah. Whatever you might think, they die. And, so, you know, I'm not against, once again, I'm not against voting to mirror the mullet closure that we did with the speckled trout and take that 30% reduction just because I don't want to see the discard mortality go up on those fish, which is what's going to happen if we don't do that. And if, you know, the speckled trout committee and the recreational guys on there were good with keeping the 4 fish and going to a slot limit and, you know, and I think think you and I talked about that and it was like a 29 or 30% reduction there.
It's a little over.
A little over. So it's about the same thing as the commercial. I mean, if we got to do something, I'm good with that. As far as trying to get to a 40% reduction, I don't see it. I really don't see reducing what the recreational guys are catching anymore. And, you know, I've said for as long, I mean, like I say, I was on the very first speckled trout committee and we were talking about discard mortality then. And there's just, in that fishery, the best thing that's happened is the fishermen have got better about how they hook the fish. You know, they don't sit there like some of the people that have never fished before and let them eat the grub down to their stomach before they, you know, they catch them. Most of these guys sitting in here that fish a lot are good at it, you know? And, so like I say, with a fishery that's hard to manage because of cold stun, and I don't really know what to say, but you know, I mean,
How often does that cold stun? How frequent does that happen?
well, we used to get one about every 3 to 4 years, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's been 5 or 6 years since we've had one.
2018 was the last major one.
Okay.
There was a small bout of cold weather in 2023 where we did see, but not significant enough.
But like I say, our thing here is we can, you know, if all we need is a motion from somebody, you know, if they want to mirror what the rec guys back here said about what the speckled trout did and a weekend closure. If you don't think we need to do anything, you know, it's up to you guys. We don't have to recommend anything if we feel like we don't need to recommend anything, or we can recommend whatever y'all want. We just need a motion and a second and see what the committee thinks. Yes, sir.
There's a trip ticket program on the commercial people. Wouldn't that better facilitate managing the commercial side on a quota as he was suggesting instead of a closure? Combining that with the speckled trout Committee's recommendation to a 16-20 and 1/24 might make a lot of sense, you know, with the additional provision that in a cold stun year, that the director could go ahead and close it
Yeah,
down.
Costa and let them, yeah. That, cause I think that's, like I think Appendix 3 was, is that the charter boat?
Yeah.
Okay.
it's a captain crew.
Yeah, and then 4 is the other,
Four
but
is the coast.
my only thing about, you know, quota's fine, but I still think that if we're trout fishing while mullet's closed, you know, or if we're mullet fishing while trout's closed, it's gonna create dead discards. And that's my only thing for mirroring that fish where, yes, sir.
So I want to speak a little bit about the quota, and then Lucas, I'm going to ask you to talk about something. So there's people that can speak about quotas much better than me, and if Jason or anybody else wants to chime in on anything that I might say that's wrong, you're more than welcome to. I think one of the issues with the quota, while in theory it's a good idea because it seems like, oh, we're getting these landings in, we can stop the fishery and shut it down when we think it's getting too hot. Like, absolutely, that's a way to manage the fishery. Unfortunately, it's very, very resource intensive, and it's for something like flounder where we have a short season and we're able to monitor that daily and actually get daily landings. That's good to be able to do. For trout, that fishery, while the majority of it does occur, if I'm correct, Melinda and Lucas, kind of in the fall, winter time area, that's when the highest landings occur. There are landings that occur throughout the year. So that quota monitoring for that would have to occur year long, and just the resources that would require for a fishery that's, I mean, kind of like a few people have said here tonight, that's not overfished, it might not be the most appropriate way to manage that fishery. And about the spotted sea trout AC's recommendation, Lucas, can you talk a little bit about why the division's recommendation wasn't a 16 to 20 inch slot and it was 14 to 20 instead?
For sure. So I think just to, if I may add just a tiny bit on
Absolutely.
the quota conversation, I think you hit it at the ends. The difference between flounder and spotted sea trout right now is the goal of what those plans were trying to do. The flounder plan is trying to rebuild a fishery that was overfished. We're not trying to do that. This fishery is definitely not overfished. You know, again, stock looks like it's in pretty good shape. In my mind, from the, you know, sitting in the fishery manager seat, a quota is that really restrictive management that you want to use when you have to get as close as you possibly can to that reduction number. There's no room for error. There's no wiggle room, which usually is something, again, when you're trying to rebuild a stock, but it's much more important to hit those numbers. When you're not overfished, you do have a little bit more wiggle room. You know, if the management that we put into place looks like it's going to give us a 40% reduction, but it comes back at you know, through recruitment, through folks fishing more, changing behavior, you know, we might not get that 40% reduction. It's a large part of the reason that the management we're recommending is more cautious, is more conservative. Because we, you know, you might not necessarily get that actual number on paper number you're looking at, but in our case, that's okay. We have that wiggle room, and especially if we build that wiggle room into that initial on paper reduction, it's all right not to hit that number dead on. When you're trying to rebuild a stock, usually you would do that very differently. You would feel very differently. You would feel like you need to hit those numbers more dead on because you want that stock to continue to grow. Sorry, that was more than a few words.
That was good.
The Spotted Sea Trout Advisory Committee. So I've heard a lot about how we didn't listen to them at all. I've heard a lot about how, you know, they came up with a solution that completely solved the problem and we just ignored it. Both of those things are flat out false. Neither of them are true whatsoever. We had 3 days. We received a lot of really, really great input from that advisory committee. I think part of this disconnect is partially the point of those species-specific advisory committees. So the point of those committees are to give us feedback on potential management options that are included in the plan. It's to hear input from experts in the field. We had commercial folks on that. We had recreational folks on that. And the one thing that was true across both of those sectors, they all had a lot of passion for spotted sea trout. We absolutely heard that. Some days it was a little more uncomfortable to hear that than others, but we absolutely heard that. But the point of those advisory committees, those species-specific advisory committees, isn't to come up with a management recommendation necessarily, or to build a consensus, I guess I should say, around a specific piece of management. It was great that folks on that committee felt that they came to that place. But that's not what the division is looking to get out of those species-specific advisory committees. And for any part that, we tried to communicate that, we tried to make sure that that was known up front. But it sounds like maybe we could have done a little better job of it.
But here's your problem with that. The man here said a few minutes ago that most people in this room are long on the tooth, I think he said.
They remember when it was different than that.
And they remember when it was what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a committee that comes up with suggestions for the division and the commission. And so all of these gentlemen here that have sat on these committees, as I have, for all the years up until about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 5, I don't know. I stepped out of it for a little while. And that AC would always send a recommendation to the commission. And the division would use the recommendations from that and draw from that. But there was also a division and there was an AC. And it's different now.
It's different now.
And
That's the important.
I don't know how long it's going to be different, but right now it's different.
Now it is different.
And I don't want to get into that argument now. Pat and I have discussed it, but I don't think we need to go no further with that right here.
I do though, just to kind of get to what Jesse really wanted me to speak to there, is why the division didn't think that was the right direction.
Well, and I mean, that's why we always did it that way, because then it's not a battle. When you go to the commission, you go, the AC brought you this, and that's the way it was when I was chairman before. And the division liked some of the things they did, but they didn't like some of the other things they did. And so the division came up with this. And it was always pretty much by the time the AC came up with a full plan, and then the division came up with a full plan, and Alan can speak to this. He saw it a lot too. The division always had a great plan. It was usually better than the AC's plan. But the AC plan was there, and these gentlemen that spend all this time in that AC meeting, they felt like they were moving something forward to the commission. And when they came out and they look at it and they go, wait a minute, we spent 3 days, and back when we were all doing it, it wasn't 3 days. It was 1 or 2 days a month
throughout the year
for 6, 7 months. And they were bringing in new information at every meeting. They were updating us, all the time. And I said, I wasn't gonna get into this now, but I'm sorry. But, so it was a better thing to bring to the commission. As sitting on the commission again, like I have now, it seemed like, because when I go into audience, I got, 6 or 8 people going, there's nothing on there that we discussed. And the thing that should be happening is there should be lots of options on the table for the commission to not just say, oh, I want that or I want that. Even if they had to piece something together like we've been doing, and it makes it good. And it's not something that takes anything away from the division, because I think, y'all are doing a great job coming up with these things, because it's not easy. What you and I talked for 45 minutes the other day, and it was, by the time I got done talking to you, I was on a whole nother place in the world where I was when I started talking to you. But so that's just, and I might not be speaking for them, but I realize, I think I am, I think I'm speaking for them. So
And I definitely understand that frustration, and I've had a lot of conversations with the honest dude, both on that committee and with some other folks. And we did take a lot of that into consideration. We did think about it. I think for that tight slot limit specifically, so that recommendation, just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page, was for a 16 to 20 inch recreational slot limit with an allowance for one fish over 24 inches. And then a January through March commercial season closure. We talked about that a lot. I think there's a lot of room for harvest recruitment in both of those pieces. A tight recreational slot like that with no commercial size change is likely going to shift a lot of harvest of those larger fish to the commercial fishery. A January to March season closure for the commercial sector with no similar closure in the recreational fishery is going to shift a ton of harvest during those months to the recreational fishery. Our concern with that was those two moving pieces, you're not going to see even remotely close. I mean, I can't say that. I can't say that quite as definitively as I just tried to say that. It's unlikely you're going to see the reduction that it looks like on paper with those recommendations. But we took a lot of what was said in that meeting into account. You know, what we heard loud and clear was if a season closure is necessary, make it as short as possible. We could end, you know, we could get to 40% purely through a season, but it'd be a heck of a lot longer than 2 months. I think 90 days was the specific number. You know, if it's under 90 days, that's palatable. The slot limits, you know, recognizing that they preferred a slot limit over a season closure, we wanted to broaden the slot. We also wanted to keep that minimum size at 14 inches because I don't think there's really a biological reason to raise that minimum size. It looks great on paper as far as the reduction of harvest and fish between 14 and 16 inches. Spotted sea trout grow real fast. They grow right into that slot really quickly. And what was the other piece that I'm missing?
I don't.
We also heard a lot of trying to mirror management between fishery management plans. And that's also, so like yes, the division did not settle on the management that the Spotted Sea Trout Advisory. It's all in the plan. Every single piece of it's in the plan.
Well, I think the biggest problem with the plan is 40%. With the fishery like it is, like I said before, when you come in to try to manage a fish that's not in trouble and you want to take 40%, then what are you going to do other than close it like you did flounder if the fishery is in any kind of bad shape at all? You know, and I see where they're coming from. You know, I don't blame them. You know, for 4 fish, I mean, it's not much. You know, you got families coming down here all the time and they come down and they can catch 1 red drum. They can't feed their family on 1 red drum, you know, at least if they could catch 4 speckled trout, they might could feed somebody. But yeah, Jesse.
So that 40% we've heard from the public a lot that, from the advisory committees and the public, a lot of that 40% on the surface when people first hear it, that does, I mean, that's a big reduction. That sounds like a lot, but kind of to Lucas's point a little bit is that is a 40% reduction on paper. That is based on historical landings. If we put these measures in place and nothing changed in the fishery, this is what the landings would be. We know that angler behavior changes. We know that when we put in a say a January, February closure, the people that may not have fished in December as much, but they were going to fish in January, those people, since it's closed in January, will likely go more in December. So while the 40% seems like it's a very high reduction to come out of the gate with something that's not overfished currently, I think it is important to remember that just because on paper it's 40%, that's not necessarily what the ultimate reduction will be. And sometimes it's better to look at least in my opinion, it's better to look at the specific options that we're looking at to get to 40% and talk about those rather than the actual number itself. But with that said, I do realize that 40% is
40% is huge. And especially when all it takes is 6 or 7 cold days and it all goes out. I mean, once again, I'm not opposed to, even if you wanted the slot to be from 14 to 20. But, to do that on the rec side, 4 fish, 16 to 20, 1 over 26. On the commercial side, close it on the weekends to mirror the striped mullet. That puts both plans at 30%. And, I mean, for a fishery that's not overfished and the spawning stock biomass is good, that's, yes, sir, Mr. Proctor.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and make a proposal, let's just to get things moving here.
Okay.
See, if people can either respond to it or not.
Oh, yeah.
I would propose that the commercial, season mimics the mullet fishery. I would propose that we have a 16 to 20 inch limit with 4 for one big trout. I would propose that we limit captains, because, I mean, if we don't have, we close recreational, man, there are a lot of captains going to lose a lot of money. I mean, I know first people do too, but whoa. But I would limit captains to 4 fish per day, because you got guys like Ricky Kellum, he's running 2 a day right now, all day long. So,
Mr. Parker, can you start your motion over just so I can capture it on the screen?
Absolutely. I'm going a little quick. Okay, we ready?
Yep.
Okay, I would propose that the commercial season mimic the mullet fishery. I would propose that we have a 16 to 20 inch slot limit with one big fish being caught. I would limit a charter captain to 4 fish daily, not 2 times a day. I would propose that if we have a cold stun event, we give the director any measures that he needs to make. He's in control. He's going to make a good decision. And I would continue with the status quo on the stop nets on both banks. That's what I would propose.
She.
Pardon?
She,
She.
the director.
I'm sorry.
So just to clarify, I'm pretty sure that the current limit for a for-hire captain is 4 fish daily.
It is.
That behavior is
I didn't-
already
Yeah,
not allowed.
I didn't know, but I just, want to make sure that.
No, I get it. I get it.
Question? I'd like to, in terms of the slot limit, I'd like to address this to the biologist. We know that we want to protect those fish that are going to spawn, but we also want to protect those fish that are spawning today. Correct? There's no doubt about it from what I've read in terms of slot limits, that is the way to go. The question I have is, you can set that lower slot, make sure that those fish have the opportunity to spawn. As far as the upper limit is concerned, do you look at the density, and if I'd have to show you this part right here, you look at and make your decision for that upper limit, that that the slot includes the most dense, fastest growing fish. I mean, have you analyzed this rather than just throwing out a slot limit? I mean, I think that I think that this is something that is really important. And I believe it needs an awful lot of analysis. What's your feeling on this?
So our slot limit, when we're coming up with that range, we look at 2 different things. We look at partially what you're talking about, like how quickly a fish is going to grow into or out of that slot limit. We also look at harvest and where harvest is actually occurring on those bigger fish. If we put that limit at And then it's a balance. That range is a balance between those two things. Because yes, on one hand, in a pure biological standpoint, you want exactly what you're saying. You want that, you want fish to stay in that slot range for the least amount of time possible from a pure biological standpoint. You want them to be able to spawn, but then you want those bigger fish to be able to continue spawning and stay out of that slot for the longest amount of time. But we also have to look at the actual reduction that we could get from implementing a slot limit. And the combination of those two things is where we settle on that 14 to 20 inches. There's still is tight enough that the bottom end is basically at L100, so at the length at which every single spotted sea trout out there should be mature before it recruits to the fishery, able to spawn.
What size is that?
14 inches is right about at L100.
And what is the max? I mean, the slot, 14 to what?
So what the division is recommending is 14 to 20 with 1/26. What is on the table here is 16 to 20, what looks like 1/24. So the 16 would bump up that size from L100. I mean, it would still be 100% of fish would be mature by 16 inches. Because 100% of them mature by 14 inches, or darkies too. And then that topping range we were looking at was, again, what that kind of trying to balance between how quickly fish will grow out of that slot and where fish are actually harvested. So like if you bump that up to 22 inches, you lose a lot of that reduction in harvest that you would get from a slot. I don't know if that actually.
I would not mind moving that 24 to 26. I'll say that too.
Okay.
Because
It honestly doesn't, it makes a tiny bit of a difference.
If you wait, I was gonna offer a friendly amendment to the motion, would be move to 24 to 26.
Yeah.
And make it 2 fish captain, 2 fish crew instead of 4 fish captain, because some of them carry a crew.
a lot of,
I don't know, that's
I
what,
think a lot of trout captains have a crew.
okay, well, we'll just leave it. I'll go for that. All right, well, the amendment will be for 26. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Larry. I have a question about slot limits. Is there any data showing bid discards increasing around the slot limit, and how the tighter you make a slot, you're gonna increase your bid discards?
So for trout, likely not. Some of that would depend on, would be very species specific. Like if you had a species where length was a determining factor in that discard mortality rate, you could see those kinds of, where depending how tight your slot is, you could increase dead discards disproportionately. In this case, with a slot limit, you're going to see more discards in the fishery. And because you're seeing more discards in the fishery, yeah, you're absolutely going to see an uptick in dead discards. But what you're also going to see is a larger downtick in harvest. So you're taking fish that are harvested, and 90% of them are now survivable. 10% of them, yes, are on average at least going to die. But 90% of those fish, so the overwhelming majority of that gain, are still going to survive. And that's a part of the reason that we layer multiple, in the division's preliminary recommendation, we layer multiple pieces on top of it. Because again, you're not going to get that full 30% reduction, because you are going to see an uptick in dead discards. Because you're going to see an uptick in discards.
Just seems like that's the elephant in the room is dead discards, and coming down the road in a few years, it's gonna be.
So that's where I might disagree a little bit, is again, because you're taking a group of fish where 100% of them are harvested and 90% are now surviving. You're not incorrect in stating that dead discards are a significant part of spotted sea trout total removal from the year. They absolutely are. recreational dead discards in a given year are roughly the size of the. It's a tough nut to crack though, because how do you address that?
Would reducing that 16 to 20 to, not 12 to 20, but 14 to 20, that would certainly reduce your.
It would reduce the dead discards, but it would increase harvest. So and that it would probably increase harvest more than it would reduce dead discards.
So-
I think the problem is dead discards they're not completely separate because they are related. But how to address them isn't through more harvest. The problem is addressing them is really difficult. That's an issue, especially in the recreational fishery, that I don't know that anybody's solved. And it is an issue that is absolutely out there. Especially as Alan is saying, more folks are moving to the region, more folks are living here, more folks are on the water. I heard a couple folks say that tonight.
So let's see what Lewis we beat that horse.
It's kind of the same regard, and I don't do a ton of trout fishing, so this could be total ignorance on my part. But with all the discussion on the discard mortality, why not require bait fishermen to use circle hooks? I mean, I do a lot of grouper fishing, and
Yeah.
I'm not good at that either. But I'm a big believer in circle hooks. I mean, those things freaking phenomenal.
And that's something, if you would like to offer a friendly amendment to Mr. Proctor, he may, that's.
I mean, maybe trout fishermen are like,
I would be glad to acquiesce to that. However, of course, it'd have to be a live bait. I don't really see the hooks being a problem most of the time in trout fishing.
Whether it's a jig or, I mean,
Even using a triple hook, with a live shrimp, which a lot of people do, and I do occasionally. That fish does not get gut hooked. It's generally in the side or on the roof.
you're a good
A
fisherman.
jig, a jig.
Talking about somebody who's not, and they're going out there,
well, let me tell you this, if you're fishing with a live shrimp, you know what you're doing.
yeah, right, fair enough, yeah.
Because
That's, you gotta use a slip core,
All right,
all that.
let's see if we can get a second.
Hey,
If we have a guy, all right, yeah.
before we get a second, can you just read the motion that's up on the screen there and make sure that
We'll change it to 26 inches, not
26.
24. And people also need to understand, if I catch a trout over 26 inches, I'm doing my damn best to keep it alive. I'm in a contest. I need to keep it alive, so maybe I might win something, which occasionally I do. But I don't even want to eat it that big.
Nobody does.
yeah.
I can't sell one that big.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm doing my best to keep it alive. I don't want to eat a fish that big. And most guys that are like me probably don't want to keep.
Can you put language in there that is encouraged to release fish?
It's like I said, I'm in some contests sometime,
Yeah.
so if I catch that damn whopper, I need to, I'm gonna make some money.
Yeah.
I need to keep that fish. And I'm
So,
gonna,
a second,
But I
possible,
will go to 28 or,
26.
oh, to 26, you did change
Yep,
that.
yep.
I just make one more point and start up. I've been looking at, again, the composition of the lengths over the years. And I'm also looking at the densities of fish by length. And I think that at 14 inches, is that the L50 for maturity?
No, that's close.
That's the one like, that's like 99 or something.
This is, if you keep the 14, you're gonna allow those fish at least a chance to spawn once. Now, when you get up into that 20-inch slot, getting up to the point where there's probably a lot less dense group of fish. If you went to a 18-inch fish, you could look here at an 18-inch fish. You're talking about a good number of fish. So I would go from 14 to 18 because of these data, and that's the only way I could.
Well, I don't think that but I had looked at that and it's not that big a difference between 16 to 20 and 14 to 18. Besides that, 14, most people in here will agree, I think, that we're sitting on that side. if you're gonna keep it to eat, there's not much to eat on a 14-inch trout. It,
Absolutely not.
back when we could flounder fish, it made a really good flounder bait, but that was about it.
Isn't that going to increase discard mortality? Because my experience recreational fishing is that it's the 12 and 13-inch fish that are, well, at least where I'm fishing, they're the ones that are being thrown back. Is that correct?
And that's because right now we got a 14-inch size limit.
Obviously,
If you increase the size, you're going to have more discards.
that
Yeah.
increases very clearly.
Meaning you'll have more death, but,
But his thing is, yeah,
You'll have less harvest,
Yeah.
which more than offsets the additional dead discard.
so the ones that do live that you throw back do spawn.
Yeah.
So that's the thing there.
Going from the 2 to 16, you're gonna leave a whole lot more spawners available to spawn at the end of the catch of fish. So I would stay with the 16, but maybe pull that 26 down to 24 and let the people have an opportunity to keep one nice fish. There's a lot less chance of
Well,
just 26.
the reason, I'll be honest with you, well,
And that's ocean, so you depend, yeah.
But the reason that I moved it up is because that gives those fish in the 20 to 24 range a chance to spawn, and they have more eggs. They spawn more, they have bigger fish and produce a lot more eggs.
So that gives you a whole size class.
But not near as many as the 14 to 16s that are in the unfishable population.
Well, maybe not as many, but they're producing more eggs.
You're,
I mean, that's-
you're talking two different things, though, Dave. Like you're talking the collective basis and the individual basis.
Right.
So
They're both true.
So you're making a little smaller fish available.
There's just more of them. There's a lot more of them in the population,
So,
so they're collective.
Let's do one thing. Let's see if we can get a second on this motion, because we have beat this motion down around. And so is anybody willing to put a second on this motion? I can't, so.
Well, what would it take to get a second? Where are we going? What do you think?
We're at 24.
Yeah, I'd second it.
All right, I'm going to 24, just to make
Just the other thing I'm not good with, I mean, that makes no sense, the 4 fish per hired captain per day.
That's kind of my thing up.
Well, that's already the rule, so,
Correct, but
yeah.
I'm for, captain not keeping a limit.
All right, let me talk to you about that.
Yeah.
Okay, I go fishing with Ricky Kelly. I'm paying more than $600.
Can I interject just a little bit for a process thing? I'm very sorry. Just to be clear, since there wasn't a second on this motion fails for a lack of a second. So we would need another.
Well, we're still in discussion. I asked if there was a second, and then he said, what would it take?
All right.
So let's just, we've gone back to the discussion period.
So
I paid out $600 damn dollars. I want some fish, and I don't want, especially, and if you've got 2 or 3 other people on the boat,
They're for it,
and those 4 fish, they, and I can tell you one thing, if you fish with a good captain like Helen, he's gonna outfish your butt to pieces. He's gonna catch 4 fish for an average guy every one to catch. So the one angler
who's
not any captain, he was only catch 1 or 2 fish, he's gonna catch 16. So that way, at least I go home with some fish.
Right.
Because
Gives you
if
2
I
more
don't,
inches.
why not?
Get there.
I mean,
Not to be cost, just get better.
Hard. Well, I feel better now, but I'm just telling you, when I first started.
I can tell you, I've
talked
to a bunch of captains and everyone I've talked to has no problems with not being part of the catch.
really, because I wouldn't agree with that. That's okay.
They're probably making work of themselves at the end of the day, cleaning more fish.
Which is significant.
I have talked to several
Amount of
captains and
Okay,
I have not.
all right, so we'll say that.
I had one.
Stay with that.
Say that was a problem.
Let the people that are
I haven't talked to Rich.
catching fish, catch.
I guarantee he wants to keep-
There's very few things. There'll be-
So they say that this motion has failed. and that we have to have another motion. So
Somebody like to make another motion.
like this motion with something different.
I would motion the same thing, but dropping the, 4 fish daily for a 4-hour
Yeah,
captain.
I mean, you're looking at.
Try that one.
You just drop it, the captain doesn't get to keep any.
So you don't want.
Yeah,
The captain gets no.
Okay.
correct.
How about two?
After that.
How about two?
Make it one. I mean, help the poor sap who's not gonna catch. I guarantee you, there are tons of captains that catch fish and the guy he's taking doesn't catch any. Especially with trout.
So I'm really sorry to interject again, just process wise. So the way Robert's Rules of Order is supposed to work is somebody makes a motion, somebody seconds it. Second, it doesn't necessarily mean they support the motion. It's just meaning this motion is on the floor, it is able to be discussed.
Okay.
So if he makes a motion, if we would like to discuss the specific of that, motion, it can be seconded, and then we can discuss that. And if people want to offer amendments to it, if people want to vote on it, and then it fails, we can offer as many motions as we want to. So,
I second.
say that again?
I second.
So now we can have discussion.
Are you amenable to two fish?
I mean, I'd like to see none. I mean, honestly, everybody I've talked to, again, I'm not a big trout guy, but a lot of the people that I've talked to from the recreational side have said that they would like to see the 4-hour captains limits dropped and just anglers on the boat. So if there's,
And remember, we're just putting
This out there for
Yeah.
commission to look at. It's not like, all right, so any more discussion?
And can we amend that?
I have just, friendly amendment.
Yes, sir.
The striped mullet and spotted sea trout have two different life histories. I don't know why we're included in there.
Because it's the striped mullet has a weekend closure.
And they're caught together.
You're not, I thought he was relating. to-
No, that's just because they're caught together.
Okay.
And so since striped mullet is closed on the weekend.
Close speckled trout on the weekend also to the commercial fishery. Then we don't have dead discard in that fishery.
This is related to the slot.
No, it is not.
Thank you.
No bearing on the slot.
And just to be clear, the intention for this motion for the striped mullet fishery, mimicking the striped mullet fishery, is that the entirety of the regulations for the fishery? Or is that just the weekend closure in the fishery? Because we should probably make that clear.
That's just the weekend closure, no slot.
And just to make sure with Mr. Dunn and Mr.
Yeah.
Porter, y'all,
Yep.
that since y'all made the motion and seconded.
Can we add to that as well?
All you got to do is ask him for amendment.
Or, circle hooks for live bait?
I don't think it hurts. I mean, I think if nothing else, it's good educational tool.
Would
you change it to 24? Well, I'm willing to make you pass, but I'd still like to see those fish protected.
Could you add circle hooks to live bait fishing?
Okay.
Can someone add on
Something here about what.
Add circle hooks for live bait fishing.
That's why. Okay. 60. See, you're getting, you're saying, I'm getting.
You got to ask them, do they want a 4 fish a day limit?
How would we?
So Lewis,
We need to
Yes, sir.
make it-
somewhere in there it needs to be put a 4 fish a day limit.
But that,
You want to do that with your friendly, I mean, I guess I can do a friendly amendment for that, can I? Because that's what the recreational fishery is wanting is 4 fish a day.
That's just for recreational.
Yeah.
So that's gonna give us a reduction.
Now you already got, you catching 4 fish a day now.
No, I mean, a total reduction on the rec side of around 30%.
Yeah. It's right there. It's somewhere between 30 and 32, the commercial somewhere between 30 and 32.
Let me ask y'all, just, do you have any idea how many And I know there are a lot of captains during the season, you know, now I'm fishing offshore, now I'm fishing for trout, now I'm fishing for drawing and bigger. But how many commercial captains really are out there catching fish, particularly just like in the winter when they're going for trout? Do you have any, y'all have any numbers on that?
Say the question one more.
How many captains?
Like for hire captains,
Yeah,
like in the
our
rec.
captain would be out there. I would assume that, you know, that licenses, obviously. We'd have-
Yeah.
Can you modify that?
I'll do it. Can we make the turn?
Change the slot, change the 1 over to whenever 24 instead of 26. Does that make it more palatable?
So if I could just clarify with circle hooks, fishing with live bait, shore spotted sea trout, the reason that the division did, we had a lot of discussion about that.
Uh-huh.
There are some enforcement issues when it comes to having that requirement for spotted sea trout. Mostly because it necessitates being able to prove intent. So if I'm fishing without a circle hook, if I'm fishing a live shrimp under a popping cork with a jig, I bait. If I'm fishing for trout, I need to use a circle hook. No, officer, I'm fishing for red drum. No, officer, I'm fishing for bluefish. I'm fishing for insert, you know, sheep's head, whatever here. It becomes an issue of compliance and of enforcing that compliance is difficult.
I guess my thought on that is that, you know, there are still people that follow the rules, some, and if nothing else, it's good message, you know? I mean, you say the same thing for offshore fishing for grouper stuff. I mean, yeah, I mean, could have a jail hook on your boat. I mean, how do you enforce that really? But I think it's just it's good messaging, right? More than anything else. If 50% of people follow it, then that will win in that regard. But I agree with you. It's probably an enforcement issue or inability to prove it, but I just think it's kind of good messaging. Yeah.
So you said, Mr. Dunn, 24 inches instead of 26 is what you want in your original motion?
I know that the second is good with that, I guess.
And are you good with that?
Yes.
And just to be clear, did y'all want to include anything about the recreational bag limit in this, or
Four fish, right?
would you like me to spell that out in the motion here, just so that?
Yeah.
Yeah, you definitely need to.
Can all of y'all read that from where you are? Don't need to make it any bigger and scroll, or? It's a long motion.
Did you want to include something regarding adaptive management for sustainable harvest? Either, you know, whether that's saying status quo, don't do it, or adopt that framework. I just feel like from our perspective, coming in front of the commission next month is good to have you know, that discussion on record for all of these decisions. I just didn't want to make sure that we missed that one.
Exactly, does that mean?
What are we missing?
The adaptive management framework for sustainable harvest.
Yeah.
So that,
to
just,
make
so
it-
whether it's, I'm not saying, I mean, obviously, you know, it's in our initial recommendations, I would fully support it. It's, but I'm not saying one way or the other, whether, you know, that's up to y'all. I just would, benefit Melinda and I with if that discussion was included in the recommendation. So the adaptive management framework just allows the director to, step in if management measures don't appear to be working. So if it doesn't look like we're achieving sustainable harvest, that adaptive management is the part that allows the director to adjust management measures to something that might have a better chance of working. The idea being we don't have to wait for that, within 5 years FMP updates.
So
Schedule.
you're gonna suggest that to the commission and all, right? And you're.
Yeah, that's part of, it's absolutely part of our management.
I mean, that's something that's up to y'all, but I mean, the commission's gonna hear that one way or another, whether it's in your proposal or not, so.
And just.
I mean, that's, yeah.
It's a reasonable fail-safe from management practices, I would guess. I don't know.
I don't trust anybody.
I think, I think you're.
Good and present it to the commission with the adaptive management and let them make their decision there.
That's
Yeah, okay.
And just to be clear, we can make not everything has to be contained in one motion. It can be split up. You can vote on one, you can make a motion to have one specific recommendation about the commercial fishery, another motion about the recreational fishery, a motion about adaptive management. It doesn't all have to be included in motions.
But we got to vote on this one if it's like y'all, if it's like.
It is all, we can vote separate, but extending the cold weather closure to June 30th. Should we do another motion on that, or should we?
We've given him total.
We gave her power to do whatever, so yeah, we told her she can do whatever.
Okay,
So,
all right, yeah, okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yes, sir.
It said, pleasure to spread my commercial fishery, comma. Why can't we just have that motion, was done to recommend to implement a 60-20 and get away from the closure stuff? Because I'm not gonna, I don't feel comfortable.
the weekend closure, once again, is mimicking the closure that's already in the strike. That has nothing to do with recreational. When you get to the 16 to 20, that starts.
There's no recreation on the weekend. No, that just relates to.
Recreational can fish on the weekend. It's just commercials won't be able to fish for speckled trout on the weekend.
Okay, commercial has to limit.
Yeah.
That's right.
Recreational will still be able to fish on the
Okay.
weekend. That has nothing to do.
Okay, thank you.
Once you get to the end of the commercial fishery, then you get to the recreational fishery. Yep. All right, how about, vote? Do you want a roll call vote?
We can do a roll call vote. Would y'all like me to read the motion just because it's kind of
Please
hard
do.
to see on the
Please do.
screen here? And Mr. Dunn, Mr. Lord, if y'all have any objections to anything in the motion, please let me know as I'm reading it. Motion by Lewis Dunn to recommend the commercial spotted sea trout season mimic the weekend closure in the striped mullet commercial fishery. Implement a 16 to 20 inch slot limit with one fish over 24 inches in the recreational fishery. Implement a 4-fish bag limit in the recreational fishery. Eliminate the captain crew allowance. And I'm actually going to put in here, eliminate the captain crew allowance in the for hire trip. Or height trip, actually. Yeah. Life is hard, y'all. Adopt the adaptive management framework in the event of a cold stun and to continue with status quo in the stop net fishery. Additionally, for the recreational fishery, require circle hooks when fishing with live bait. Is that the motion that y'all?
All right. Motion second, roll call vote.
All right. All right, so Jeff Buckle, absent. Lewis Dunn.
I gotta vote yes for it, right?
Brent Fulcher is absent. Christopher Hickman is absent. Larry Lord.
Aye.
Alan Powell.
I don't like the 16-inch for 14, but I'll vote for it.
Randy Proctor.
Yay.
William Tarpley.
Aye.
Scott Whitley is absent. Mike Blanton, absent. And Sammy Corbett.
Yes. Okay. Motion passed unanimously. And any issues from anybody?
Anything else? Not really adjourn.
Say one thing, Sammy.
Yes, sir.
Are you gonna deal with the commercial?
We did. That was the top part. It mimicked the, gave a 31 point something percent reduction in the commercial fishery.
So the commercial fishery then is gonna be closed
The weekend
Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
will be closed
Outside.
December and October. It'll be closed on Friday and Saturday. And then from October to the end of December, it'll be closed on